In this video, I will be providing tips and strategies to help you rank up in draft on MTG Arena. I will be covering specific information for each rank to help you climb in that rank and get better at Magic so you'll be prepared for the next rank and then how to climb through that rank and so forth. First up is Bronze. And the first thing about Bronze is that you just want to focus on fundamentals. You're going to be new to draft. There's a lot to think about, so you don't want to have to get too complicated with your deck building. Play 2 colors, 17 lands, 13 or more creatures, and then have a basic mana curve, which means you have more cheap spells than expensive spells. And this is just going to make it much easier on you if you don't have to think about these things. Don't worry about anything fancier than that, and you'll be in relatively good shape. You also want to play an easy strategy, which means put cards that affect the board state into your deck. So creatures, removal, and combat tricks. And you can kind of ignore a lot of the other cards that you're going to be dealing with because they're not going to affect the board state. And when you're at this level, you just want to make sure that your deck is filled with functional cards at a high density so that you're playing real games of Magic and not just spinning your wheels and losing games to yourself by trying to get too fancy with what you're doing. And in Bronze, you're going to climb no matter what because you don't lose any ranking points for losses. And as long as you have a solid deck that is actually capable of winning because it has creatures, because it has removal, because it has all of these spells that impact the board, you're going to be able to climb out of Bronze and start getting a good grasp on how Magic the Gathering works in the draft format. Next up is Silver. And at this point, you're going to start working on your card evaluation because one of the best ways to win in draft is by having a better deck than your opponent. So if you can do that in Silver, you are going to climb through much faster because your opponent is still going to be putting bad cards in their deck because they're newer and they don't understand card evaluation. So if you put a little bit of work into this area, you're going to see a lot of return in the Silver rank. So things like the vanilla test, which is where you evaluate creatures based on their stat line before just reading all of their text. So just knowing that, hey, a 3-mana 3/3 is probably going to be pretty solid for my deck no matter what text is on the card. That's the sort of thing that you learn from the vanilla test. And then Quadrant Theory is another good tool for card evaluation, thinking about how cards are going to play out when you are in the developing stages of the game, when you are ahead in the game, when you are behind in the game, and when you are at parity in the game. And cards that are good in all 4 quadrants, or especially in the quadrant where you are behind, are oftentimes a little bit better because those are the situations where you really need the help. A lot of cards can win you the game when you're already ahead. Not as many cards can help you claw back the wins when you are behind. So just keep that in mind with your card evaluation. And I'm not going to go too in depth on this because it's an entire topic on its own, but I have videos on it on my channel if you want to improve that element of your gameplay. But next, you're going to want to start reading signals, which is inherently tied to card evaluation because in order to read signals in the draft portion, you have to know which cards are good. So you're going to want to ask yourself some questions. What colors am I seeing? Are you seeing a lot of good red and blue cards? Maybe red and blue are open. That's the sort of basic element of signal reading. Another question, what colors are absent? If you're not seeing a lot of black and green cards, that could mean that blue and red are more open or white is open and that sort of thing as well. You also want to ask what colors are my best cards, because if you just have a lot of good red cards, it means that a lot of those cards must have gotten passed to you. And so that means that you were taking good red cards out of the packs. The person that was passing them to you was not taking those good red cards, so maybe red is open. And then the final thing is, should I lock into my colors? This is the sort of thing that you can push later and later as you get better at reading signals and better at deck building. But it's just generally nice to think, am I going to get further benefits from staying open, or am I happy with the cards that I have if I lock into these colors now? So that's just the sort of basic elements. Deck building and just having a stronger deck than your opponent is definitely something you can do when you are in Silver to help you climb. Next up is Gold. You've got some experience. You've climbed through Bronze. You've climbed through Silver. You've kind of got the basics of draft down. And now is when you should start be playing more complex decks. You want to put non-cabs cards into your deck. So card draw effects, some auras maybe if they're good, some equipments maybe if they're good. The sorts of cards that aren't as straightforward. They aren't just creatures or removal spells. They are a little bit more complicated. These are the sorts of cards you want to begin exploring and making sure you know how to maximize, because they're going to help you build better decks over time because you don't just want to be locked into the simple strategies forever. Speaking of which, you want to be able to play control decks, which is oftentimes harder when you are a new player because knowing threat assessment and how to time your removal spells and use your life total as a resource is harder when you're a new player. But control decks are really an important part of draft, and synergy decks that are built around either a specific build around card or a specific synergy type package that you have in your deck where you're trying to combine cards of one type with another to get a nice little synergy and boost the power level of both cards. So those are the sorts of things you want to get better at when you are in Gold rank, and then learning how to splash so that if you do have a really powerful card, you can improve your deck by including it, even if it does require a more complex mana base. So these are all things you should be working on in Gold rank, as well as leveling up your gameplay, because you're going to start playing against more formidable formidable opponents. Your opponents also have more experience in draft, but by the time you get to gold rank, so you want to make sure that you can actually compete with them by making solid plays. And to help you with that, you need to make sure you get good value from your cards, which means, first of all, saving your removal spells for threats that you actually need your removal to answer, making sure your creatures trade favorably, so you're not just chump blocking your opponent's creatures when you're at 20 life, and you're making sure that your 2/2s are trading for things like 2/2s on your opponent's side of the board, instead of having like your 3/3 get double blocked and trade for a 2/2 and trading down in value. So make sure you get good value from your cards. Plan your turn in advance so you don't just forget something and make a silly mistake that costs you an advantage or a resource. And now that you're more familiar with the game, you can start thinking about your opponent's cards instead of just focusing on making the correct play with your own cards, because you should be a little bit better at knowing, okay, I've played with these cards a little bit. I've drafted from all the way up from bronze down through silver, now into gold. I know what the cards do. I can start thinking, okay, my opponent has 4 mana up and they probably have something, so I should adjust my play accordingly. It shouldn't just be, oh, I'm playing my cards and maximizing my own turns. You need to also put a little bit of thought into your opponent's turn when you are climbing through gold. Now, platinum is the first big hurdle for ranking up because it's the first rank where you don't get more points on the ranked ladder for a win than for a loss. You get 1 point up for a win, 1 point down for a loss. So platinum, if you're not better than your opponents, you are going to struggle to rank up here. So once you're in platinum, you want to level up your drafting once more. So in silver, we talked about how you could beat your opponents by having higher quality cards. In platinum, that's almost like a barrier for entry, like something you have to clear in order to just compete in platinum, because you need to have consistently solid decks. And if you ever have a weak deck, you're just going to get beaten by opponents that know how to draft and know how to get good decks. So to level up your drafting, you want to stay open for longer. You don't want to lock in after your first couple picks, even if that's a little bit of an advantage in the earlier stages when you don't know what all the cards do and you're still learning. You want to stay open for longer so you can maximize your chances of getting past strong cards and building a strong deck. You also want to know each card's value so you can know what a signal will be. If the card is better than the other cards in the pack, you need to know that so you can know, oh, is this going to be a signal for my deck, and is it something that maybe is worth switching for to play. You also want to evaluate your deck's needs during the draft portion. So instead of just evaluating cards on raw power level, you want to think, oh, I really need a 2-drop creature right now. So even though this other card is better, I'm just going to take the 2-drop. Or, oh, I really need removal spells. This isn't the best removal spell in the world, but my deck needs some way to answer opposing threats, so I'm going to take the removal spell. These are the sorts of things you want to make sure you do so that your deck can be consistently solid. You're also going to want to learn the draft meta, because this is an important part of playing in a specific set environment, is that you need to know what sorts of cards are relevant in that meta. So know the best strategies if there's a particular color that's really strong, so you want to bias your draft picks towards playing that color. If there's a particular color pair that's really strong, if the format is really fast and there's a lot of good aggro decks, then you want to know that when you are drafting so you can adjust your deck accordingly. You also want to understand the play patterns of the formats. Some formats it's really important to have a couple of early plays to get onto the board so that you can pressure opposing planeswalkers or battles or whichever things are in that format. That means it's really important to get on the board state. And in other formats, it's really important to have a good late game, or it's really important to be able to answer key threats or have a removal spell for their bomb rare, or whatever the specific needs of the format are. It's important to know those so that you can adjust your play patterns accordingly, save your removal spell if you need it, know whether or not you should just fire your removal spell off instantly, things like that. You also want to memorize the key cards. You don't need to know the entire set inside and out, but you should at least know the combat tricks that are going to be played, so that if your opponent has 3 mana up and attacks you with a suspicious attack, you're like, okay, these are the 3 cards they might be representing. How bad is it for me if they have those cards? And these are just things you need to know if you want to climb in platinum, because your opponents a lot of the time are going to know these things and are going to be using it to their advantage. So you don't want to put yourself at that informational deficit. Next up is Diamond. You've climbed all the way through Platinum, and now you're facing other people that have also climbed all the way through Platinum. You're almost at Mythic, but you've got this big hurdle to go, and Diamond is often one of the challenging ones to rank through for a lot of players. It can be quite time-consuming as well, unless you're absolutely destroying people, which does not happen a ton in Diamond. When you're in Diamond, you are going to want to master the set. Now, in Platinum, we talked about how you should know the draft meta. Mastering the set is the next level above that. You need to be able to play every strategy, the good strategies, the bad strategies, know what makes those decks tick, because you're going to have to get every ounce of value out of every draft that you do. You also going to know each matchup that you're going to face. So if you're playing against the green-white deck in the format, you need to know, okay, this card has to die if it comes into play, or, oh, that card can survive because if they play their follow-up card, I need to have a removal spell for that. These are the sorts of things where you get that from experience playing. It takes some time to climb through these ranks. You get a lot more experience with the cards, and so you should be able to get a good understanding of each matchup, or even just basic things in general, like, oh, my opponent started the game off with a Swamp swamp. This is going to be a slower matchup. I should make sure I eke every bit of value out of my cards instead of just putting them into the board as fast as possible, stuff like that. You're also going to want to know niche interactions. So the fringe cards that maybe aren't as playable, you need to know when you should be including those cards in your decks. You should also know things like, oh, every time I play this particular card, it has this minor synergy with this other card that if I play both of them in play at the same time, they both get a little bit of a boost. Or my opponent has these cards in play. That means they might be playing this other card because people only play this one card if they're playing this other card. Those sorts of niche things that are really kind of hard to know unless you're playing the set a ton and really thinking about it deeply. You also want to master the gameplay, which means you're going to want to plan multiple turns ahead. We already talked about planning your turn in advance, but you also want to start planning, okay, I'm going to do this on this turn, my opponent's likely to do this on their turn, and then on my next turn, I'll have this much mana, I'll have these 3 cards in my hand, and I'm going to want to do this. So you want to start planning farther in advance so you can know how your cards are going to line up multiple turns in a row. And you also want to foil your opponent's plans. If you know that they're trying to play a certain synergy package, you want to disrupt that. If your opponent has a bunch of cards in hand and you can kind of guess what they are, like maybe they made an attack that indicated one combat trick and then they held up their mana another turn, which indicated a counter spell or things like that, you want to foil your opponent's plans whenever possible because they're going to be a relatively skilled player at this point because they've climbed all the way into Diamond. And so they're going to have plans of their own. And if you're not trying to mess with your opponent's plan, if you're just trying to enact your own game plan, you're going to be at a disadvantage because they're going to be trying to disrupt you. You also want to identify your weaknesses and fix them, which is a key element of mastering your own gameplay, is knowing when you make a mistake and when it's just something that should be identified as like variance or something of that nature. So knowing what you do and what your weaknesses are and then working consciously towards improving that is really important at this level because it can be frustrating to lose games, but it's much better to lose games and then learn from them rather than just lose games and then lose another game to that exact same flaw. Once you make it through Diamond, you're into Mythic, and this is a lot of the times the goal for players, but if you do want to climb in Mythic, which can be very tricky because you have to have a very high win rate to do so, you want to maximize tiny edges. That's the key in Mythic. So you want to do things like knowing every single card in the set, where it should be played, if ever, what strategies it might have a home in, and any niche interactions with every single card. You don't need to know their names necessarily, but if you see like the picture of the card or it gets put into play, you shouldn't have any cards that you haven't really like thought about or at least like tried out in your draft at this point. So you should know what all the cards do and like from your memory almost. You should also know what gets played. So instead of just knowing, oh, these are the 3 combat tricks in the set and I need to be aware of all of them, you should be like, well, my opponent made this attack, which probably means they have this combat trick. I know that they have the mana available to cast A, B, or C, but C never gets played. B only gets played in this one color pair, and so they probably have A. And that's the sort of thing that you get from playing a lot and really thinking about the cards. You should also be able to estimate wheeling ons at this point, like, oh, I want this card for my deck, but I also want this card for my deck. But this card is like 20% to wheel, and so I'm going to take this one card so that if this other card wheels, I get double the power level for my deck, and it really helps me out. So knowing like enough about the cards to know whether something's going to wheel is definitely an important element. And then things like guessing your opponent's hand, which definitely comes from the mastering your gameplay levels setup, but like being like, okay, my opponent has 2 cards in hand, I think they have these exact 2 cards, or they didn't do anything on turn 4, they have 5 cards in hand, this is their color pair, this is the type of strategy they have, I think they have this counter spell, I'm going to try to play around it, that sort of thing. And then you also want to master the mental game because climbing through Mythic can be really mentally taxing. So you want to make sure that you play with your full focus at all times and that you're not just distracted. You're not doing something on the side while you're playing, if you want to climb at least. You want to play with your full focus so that you can think about, okay, my opponent is on this turn, my opponent's doing this, these are the cards they might have, these are what my cards are, these are the cards I could draw, these are the cards they could draw. You need to have a lot of focus to do all of that. So make sure you play with your full focus and then accept variance. Know that it's going to be a part of the game. And don't let it put you on tilt if something happens that is unlucky for you, because if you get on tilt, which means that you kind of lose your mental game, you start playing worse and you just lose a couple of games, and that can be really hard to recover from if you are trying to climb in Mythic, because every game loss can be a pretty big swing for your ranking. So you don't want to lose any games that you don't have to, and that means accepting variance when it happens and knowing that not every game is in your control, so that you can really do your best in the games that are under your control. Some final summary type things as we go through here. In Bronze, you want to focus on fundamentals and play an easy strategy. In Silver, you want to work on card evaluation and start reading signals. In Gold, you want to play more complex decks and level up your gameplay. And then in these advanced ranks, you want to level up your drafting and learn the draft meta in Platinum. You want to master the set and master the gameplay in Diamond. And then in Mythic, you want to maximize tiny edges and master the mental game. The final tips I have are, remember that improvement takes time and practice. Just because you watch this sort of video doesn't mean you're going to be able to implement all of these things right away. It is a lot of time and effort to improve these elements, even if they sound relatively straightforward. So just remember that as you're going, and make sure that you are having fun playing, because it does take a lot of time if you are trying to climb on MTG Arena. So if you're having fun with the process, if you're enjoying playing, and if you're enjoying climbing up the ladder, then that's time well spent. But if you're doing this as like some sort of way to prove that you can be better or something like that, and you're not actually enjoying it, and you're not able to like do it with a smile on your face essentially, then it's probably not a good use of your time. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Hit that thumbs up button, subscribe for more, and comment with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And if you made it to the end of the video, leave hashtag #TheClimb in the comments section down below to let me know you made it all the way to the end. That's going to do it for this one. I hope to see you on the ladder, and I'll talk to you next time.